let me ask you about this idea that of democracy being aligned with the left and with progressive policy. This, the phrase was all over, MSNBC and other media outlets of democracy being on the ballot, right? It was a Democratic Party talking point. I believe Kamala Harris used it in her ads. And so talk about, I guess, to the extent that you can, like why Democrats thought that that would be an effective messaging strategy, or where that kind of synergy came from, and then maybe why, if for the folks that you talked to, that wasn't as effective.
So I think the strategy comes from, it's a proxy for, Trump being a singular threat to democratic norms in our democracy, and post January 6th, the bringing that back up, bringing the fact that he has threatened retribution, that he's threatened to politicize the judiciary. And so I think that there's validity to that. I think the challenges with it as a talking point are a few fold. One, I think this is actually a big one too. There's been a lot of research that demonstrates that people actually don't vote on democracy issues front and center. This is taken place in countries around the world. They've done, different studies and interventions on this, and it's just not front and center. And so I think even you saw in this election, a lot of people said, well, we voted based on how expensive milk and eggs had gotten, not because of democracy issues. From a strategic perspective, I think that there's a fault line there. From a broader principled perspective, I think the challenge is, it did become proxy for democracy became politicized. And so for folks on the right, it became seen as they're using this issue as a stand-in, even if you think Trump's a threat. And then the other challenge is that Democrats, and I want to distinguish, because I think it's really important, between the pro-democracy community and the Democratic Party, because I don't think they should be one and the same. But Democrats, and I'm not both sides in this, because invoking and inserting and fermenting insurrection is not the same as other behavior, but have engaged in, in anti-small d democratic behavior, whether it's propping up more right-leaning MAGA candidates in primaries so that they can, win, whether it's using language like voter suppression in states like Georgia, where the evidence has not been found to be the case. Honestly, and this was an election thing, but we're talking the morning after President Biden pardoned his son. And that's the type of thing that's going to galvanize the right, in the sense of saying, you said that you wouldn't do this. You said that you were fighting for democracy, and now you're putting, policy outcomes above, democracy issues. And so I just think it becomes, whether or not you believe that Trump's an existential threat, I think, one, it's not effective strategically, but two, just sort of it ferments in this notion that democracy is a stand-in for policy priorities rather than democracy itself.
So the kind of, or one counter argument to that I often hear, I'm sure you do too, is that really what we mean when we're talking about democracy is multiracial democracy or equitable, inclusive democracy, right? And anytime that you even gesture toward or try to bring in, conservative leaning folks, it's seen as like that as a barrier or an impediment to moving toward multiracial democracy. It's like there's just this whether explicit or implicit, this idea that like you're bringing racism into it, or you're bringing white supremacy into the conversation, and there's just no room for that if the goal is to, keep pushing toward a fully inclusive, multiracial democracy. So I guess I'm sure you've been in rooms where this conversation has happened as well. Like what do you say to that, any effort to broaden the net comes at the expense of progress on other fronts?
I mean, the first thing I'd look at is just the changing demographic rates in the 2024 election. And so you had a lot more racial diversity in terms of turnout for Republicans and support for Trump. And so I just don't think that strategy holds true. I think even if you put that aside, and I mean, I think that part of it is that, many racial groups do not want to be, nor are a monolithic, and care about a whole host of issues. And so I think that's part of it. I think that it is a challenging endeavor to figure out how to ensure that this multiracial democracy survives and thrives. The research I've read is that there's never been a democracy in the history of the world where you had one racial group that was the majority become the minority, which will happen with white people in this country in the next few decades, and for that democracy to thrive. So I do think that that's a legitimate concern in terms of how do you actually ensure that democracy works. I guess my response to this is, if you believe that conservatives are less amenable to talking about issues of race and democracy, the answer is not to not invite them into the room. The answer is to have complex conversations about what it actually means to move forward. And I think that that is even more urgent given the results of the 2024 election, where I think Democrats probably essentially made a bet that some of these racial demographics would keep voting for them because they're Democrats, as opposed to actually addressing the issues at hand. And so I think that there are legitimate concerns with how Republicans in recent years have addressed issues of racial equality. But if you believe that, the best way to actually address that is to have those folks in the room.
I want to close here by talking about messaging. So I think one of the reasons that the democracy ecosystem is so insular in some parts, because it's really hard to talk about these things to people who aren't already bought
Yeah.
in some ways. And I think you wrote another piece. I'm forgetting the co-author, so please
Lily
say that when you talk
Deshevsky.
about it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, about like how to talk about these things moving forward to reach people who might think that not might think that who feel that the economy or immigration or other issues are their top concern and would rank democracy, seventh or eighth on a list of the top 10 things that motivate their votes and political behavior and decision making.
Yeah. So Lily and I wrote a piece in Democracy Notes that talked about the communications part of it. So one critique, just to start out, is, and I say all this lovingly, I guess, because there's a lot of folks that are working very hard in this ecosystem, but there was a lot of focus on trust in elections leading up to 2024, and necessarily so. But I was in a lot of conference calls or a lot of listservs where folks would send along talking points on how best to talk to people about elections or issues of democracy that were very clearly based on polling and not really based on talking to real people. And so this is something that, having worked with folks across the country and tried to think about some of these issues of trust in elections, we talked to a lot of real conservatives and Republicans that were saying, this is what resonates. That's sort of how we got to to realize that the democracy framing itself, the democracy word choice itself was problematic. So one thing I would just say on the messaging is that we gotta get out and talk to folks. So I think that part is really important. The second piece is, I mean, the point that we were trying to make in the article was that people are not equating democracy with anything to do with their quality of life. And I think that this goes to the, like, okay, I might not be a big fan of Trump. I think what he did on January 6th was problematic. I can't afford groceries. And so I don't have the luxury to put issues of democracy front and center. This is also something that has happened in countries around the world, which is why, from a strategic perspective, I'm still a little confused why Democrats use the democracy as on the ballot. But if you look at countries like El Salvador, where Bukele took power and sort of used the influx of gangs as ways to consolidate that power, a lot of people are like, yeah, he's infringing on our rights, but we have more security now. And so I just think that how you tie in having basic, democratic rights and responsibilities with quality of life is something that we have to do. I don't 100% know how to do that. I think a lot of it is conversations with folks to really understand what democracy means to them. and what it means to them at the local level. I think it is bringing in that pluralistic perspective into the conversation. And so this is, I guess I would say, like, this is the challenge for the democracy community. We're not saying like, here are the messaging points to really demonstrate how to make democracy an issue that ties to people's everyday lives. We just know that we need to do that. And the way
Mhm.
to do that is to talk to people in communities. And I think that
Yeah.
that's, I think coming out of 2024, a lesson that I'm taking, which I'm still not 100% sure that the democracy community is taking. I mean, we're like 4 weeks out, so we'll see, but just is the importance of really listening deeply rather than sort of like coming at it right away and saying like, okay, I have this silver bullet solution. I know what to say. I know what to do. We need to act. That there does need to be a little bit of a, okay, like let's figure out what's been working and what's not. And actually, be responsive to what people want rather than talking about what we think people need.